Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us in our second webinar of our Winter Wonderland 2016 webinar series. Today we have a very informative webinar discussing data migration practices and strategies led by our technical consultants based in Lakeland, Florida, Carl C. and Ben Hart. Due to popular demand, we're going to move forward. The crowds are riding. Introducing from Lakeland, Florida, Carl C. and Ben Harden. Thanks.
So today we're talking about migration best practices. So when we were putting this together, we were trying to figure out why we were talking about this. A lot of people have already gone to version 10, maybe not doing migrations. But this really comes together for testing purposes too, for user acceptance testing. So we're going to take a look at the overall migration overview of the migration. We're going to talk about the environment migration, the application migration, and then beyond LSF and Landmark, what it goes into. Oops, that was the agenda. So talking about an overview, a couple key points here. You can break it out into two separate parts. You can separate out to the environment migration, which is where you want to get your security and all your users moved over, and then as well as the data migration, actually moving your data over. Two things on this. One, if you already have a federated environment, which a lot of version 10 customers do at this point, you have to sync your migration keys before your two environments. If that's not already done, it can be a little bit tricky, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. The second part to that is when you do your data copy for your migration, typically you want to stop processing in your production environment. So that can be a little bit tricky coordinating as far as stopping everything that's ongoing in your production environment to do that data copy. So one of the first key things is that you'll learn as we go through, the versions have to match. So what versions are we talking about? We're talking about the Lawson System Foundation, the environment, the S3 applications, the Landmark runtime, and the Landmark applications. So that means any environment patches, all your CTPs for your applications, and then of course the Landmark CU, as well as if you're having Landmark applications such as talent management or contract management, those have to be the same as well to bring those over. Just a couple examples for that. Somewhat recently, the benefit CTPs for the ACA, those introduced new tables and new fields. So if you have that in one environment, not the other, you won't really be able to do your data copy for bringing that over. Also on the Landmark side, your Landmark environment controls the IPA tables, the PFI tables. So if that CU is different in between your two environments, you might have difference in the table fields there, where you're not going to be able to copy that data over. So how do you verify that everything is the same? What we recommend, what we use, and what we install for all our on-premise installations is Lawson Information Investigator. It's a very simple Perl-based tool. There's no downtime to install it. You can install it in your production environment at any point. It's mainly compatible with LSF and Landmark, as well as LBI and LBP. It does offer a graphical interface, so you can log into it and see all your server hardware information along with each application version, even self-service applications like Employee Self-Service and Requisition Center. And then you can use this to run it in both environments and do a comparison. For us personally, we usually use the XML export. So we export XML and then you use the text editor to do comparisons to see if anything's missing between the two environments. Security migration, minions. For Lawson Security, we use the LS dump and LS load tools. We do typically recommend copying all 6 profiles for the Lawson Security. And we also recommend not doing the overwrite. So basically it just copies over anything new. And we have some examples of the commands there. Couple little gotchas for copying over Lawson Security. One of them is the security profile name. You might have different profile names between your test and production environments. And the second thing is the product line name. So Lawson Security controls access to your product line. So if the product line is different than your security class roles, the rules there will be different. So you have to watch out for that when you're copying them across. One note there, to get the users over, when you bring over the ls dump and ls load, if there's any users that do not exist in that environment, it will create a load users for you. So you can use that to bring over any users that exist in your source environment, not your target. And then Landmark Security as well. That's a different set of security, so you want to bring that over. Even if you only have IPA, you have Landmark Security. Definitely if you have other Landmark applications. So you use the CD export to export and import that over. You do want to do it for each product line that you have. So just like LSF, Landmark has a gen, and then it has a product line for each Landmark application. So you basically do the CD export and import, and then you want to do an update in each product line that you import there. For the identities, that's done through SSO config, and there's actually a very great KB article out on Infor Extreme that I would recommend referencing. This details how to do the export for each environment that you have, or each platform that you have, whether it's Unix, Windows, or iSeries. A couple things to watch out for there. You want to remove the services from that export before you import it over. You don't want to be importing import services from your source environment into your target environment, like single sign-on services and such. We also typically leave the override false so that it's just bringing over anything new and not updating current identities there. And then the command there is using the -L. Hi.
If I wanted to know the syntax for exporting out the identities, that's different based on the platform I'm on, right?
For iSeries, yes. So, yeah, and that's all detailed in the KB article for the SSO config syntax. One other thing to watch out for Windows there. Windows, with your batch users, you have the NTID. So typically, as good practice, you want to maintain that the same in all your environments. So the way that you can do that is by making sure that you bring over the UID when you import the identities. That's what maintains the NTID, so it links it up to the jobs and print manager and all that on the batch side. And the Landmark environment data. So you can use the DA export commands to export only environment-related data. So you would run this for your IPA product line or your TM product line. And this will actually export all actors and security roles and assignments for that product line, which you can then bring over to your target environment. So this is a way of getting the actors over and the security class assignments. And just as in LSF, the Landmark identities are separate. So that's a separate command to run. That's the export identities on the Landmark side. One kind of trick to this is that when you export it, it does not export the password for any identities. So it exports asterisks. So this is in the Landmark administration guide as well. But one thing you have to do there is to remove all the asterisks before you import it in, and then you have to reset the passwords for those identities. So depending on which ones you're doing, it can be a little bit tricky. And last but not least, our favorite, Mr. Benjamin Harden's favorite. You always want to make sure that you do the ISS Sink after you're done here, so to sync the two together.
Yeah, and I would say with that, on that note, you'll notice when you hit the sync button that, oh, my off? Sorry. Where is it? Did I click it? Am I good? Okay, sorry. So you'll notice when you hit that sync button right there in the middle of the screen, looks like a refresh button. It will give you quite an ominous warning message, and for that reason, you definitely want to back up the systems before you sync anytime, because that is a permanent change. So.
Do you want to give an example of what kind of stuff do you back up?
His microphone's not working.
Okay.
So you want to back up both systems. Typically we back up the lauder system files. So there's those .sso files. Yeah, and as well as the gen databases. So you definitely want to back those up before you do the ISS Sink, just to make sure that you have a clean restore point there. And last but not least, application data. So everything that we've talked about so far is kind of prep work. It's prepping to get to the point where you can actually bring that application data over. Make sure that you have a clean system, everything's matched up, you have all your users and security, so you're to that point. One of the key things here is if you do have a Landmark application like talent management or strategic sourcing, you want to pull that data copy at the same time as your Lawson applications. So as far as the data export for pulling your LSF S3 data and your talent management Landmark application data, you want to pull those at the same time so that they're matched together and synchronized together. So for the application data copy, you have several options. The most common is actually not technically supported by Infor. Typically, because of the database size, a lot of clients use database tools like SQL Server backup and restore, or use the Oracle export and import options to bring that data over. Just that it ends up being a lot faster for exporting and copying the data over. There are some things that we want to watch out there for. A lot of times the database name could be different, or it's a different schema, or definitely different database users have access to that database. So at least specifically to the Microsoft side, a lot of times when you do a backup and restore, it breaks those connections. So you want to be sure that you restore those users.
You also want to make sure you're not overwriting the log files, and there's another
like the logical file names.
Logical file names with both of those, because it will pull in whatever the database was originally named. So the official supported method is using the Lawson or Infor delivered utilities. So there's several different options there. You have the export sysdb, db copy, db dump. Some of the those can be used for in different situations. You can also, for some of those, like the db copy or the db dump, you can multi-thread those where you're running them multiple at the same time. But typically speaking, those are a lot slower than the standard database utilities. Same thing on the Landmark side. The officially supported way is DA export and DA import. So that will export all the data basically to CSV files in a directory, and then you copy those over and run the same command to import those CSV files. What we've seen pretty quickly on the Landmark side and with the systems such as talent management, it stores everything in the database. So even documents, PDFs, Word documents, and that starts filling up space very quickly, where it becomes pretty quickly not really an option to use those Lawson utilities. One key thing there, anytime you're doing a data migration, it's probably a good idea to take a product line count before you copy the data. So you want to get a count right before you copy the data, and then you want to do a count afterwards to just kind of compare those record counts, make sure that you got everything pulled over. Also on the Landmark configurations, this is something that you want to do before you actually, if you have a Landmark application, before you actually migrate the data. One thing you might want to do is export your current configurations, so your configuration parameter or the application configurations. That way you can re-import them afterwards and not lose that setup. Of course, the other option is to just do the migration and then manually go into the Landmark application and change all those configurations back. As we mentioned before, one key thing here is for Landmark applications, it contains encrypted data. A lot of the applications do. So if you have a federated system between LSF and Landmark, you have to synchronize your keys between your source environment and your target environment. It's kind of just a one-time setup, so that when you do the data copy, you can actually read that encrypted information, such as social security number. One of the key things that we learned about here is that the identity passwords are also
encrypted by that same encryption key. So if you do have to go through this encryption key sink, your target environment is going to lose those passwords. So this will have to be reset within the application as part of that configuration. Beyond LSF and Landmark. So far, everything we've talked about is just LSF and Landmark. As you start implementing more and more applications into your environment, it becomes more and more complex. So business intelligence that you might want to migrate as well.
Yeah, I'd say with LBI, typically you only want to add the reports that bring over the reports that you've added since, if you're refreshing your data. That way you're not going through and republishing each of your reports and changing the data source in Crystal for every one of them. And for dashboards, every time you migrate those over, you're going to have to change all the links in there. So in each case, you have to make sure that you're not going to go through a lot of extra work to just bring it all over at once and change every link and report individually.
Good point. Also, mobile supply chain. The official supported method is to basically recreate that setup and configuration in your target environment. There have been certain situations where we've been able to migrate that data, which would bring over the setup configuration as well as the transactional history. But typically, it needs to be the same platform, SQL to SQL, as well as the same application version to make that happen and make it happy. The other thing that you might want to consider copying over is any customizations or personalizations. If you have 4GL or even bringing over your IPA flows, as well as Design Studio forms and Smart Office personalizations. Those can all be migrated from environment to environment as well. And that brings us to questions, which we don't have any.
It's a perfect presentation.
Should we wrap it up? Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending our Lawson data. Lisa Lawson? No, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. They can hear me. Thank you everyone for attending our Lawson data migration webinar. Again, this will be up online. We'll have